Hello, boys and girls. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. In today's video, we're going to talk about famous 1983 CIA report that compared Soviet and American diet and amount of calories we consumed. But before we begin, I would like to mention something interesting. So everyone probably knows about KGB, КГБ, Комитет государственной безопасности. So it should be translated as CSS, the Committee of State Security, but for some reason in English it's also KGB. Meanwhile, CIA is ЦРУ in Russian, so it's a Центральное разведывательное управление, and if you work for the CIA, you are called ЦРУшник. ЦРУшник. So ЦРУ and ЦРУшник. And similarly, FBI is ФБР in Russian, Федеральное бюро расследований, ФБР. And now let's take a look at that famous CIA report from January of 1983. It was classified till 2007, and honestly I have no idea what was the reason to classify this document. So first I'm gonna read the entire document and then we're gonna try to analyze it, and of course I would love to have your input, so your comments are more than welcome. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that this CIA report is such a darling on Reddit. People mention it all the time, especially my favorite tankies. So here we go. January 8, 1983. Strength diet. American and Soviet citizens eat about the same amount of food each day, but the Soviet diet may be more nutritious. According to a CIA report released today, both nationalities may be eating too much for good health. The CIA drew no conclusions about the nutritional makeup of the Soviet and American diets, but commonly accepted US health views suggest that the Soviet diet may be slightly better. According to the Central Intelligence Agency, an average Soviet citizen consumes 3,280 calories a day compared to 3,520 calories for the American. The average daily calorie intake in the Soviet Union is grain products and potatoes, 44%, sugar, 13%, dairy and eggs, 11%, fats and oils, 17%, meat and fish, 8%, with 7% other products. The American consumes daily grain products and potatoes, 26%, sugar, 17%, dairy and eggs, 12%, fats and oils, 18%, meat and fish, 21%, and 6% other products. Americans eat more meat and fish, more sugar, more dairy products and eggs, and more fats and oils and less grain than the average Soviet citizen, and consume more calories. Generally held nutritional standards suggest individuals need fewer calories, less meat, less sugar, and more grain to stay fit. Okay, so let's break down this report using a pie chart. I think this visual will help us to understand what's going on. And I would like to thank my friend Bogdan from Moldova, who's helping me with my videos, and he made this pie chart for me. So 50% of American and Soviet diet are very similar. So let's start with sugar. 13% Soviet versus 17% American. I mean, it's pretty close, within 4%. Of course, it'd be nice to find out more details in which form Americans consume sugar. I believe a lot of it is in the foods, like even ketchup has sugar, right? Hot dogs have sugar. A lot of foods in America, and I guess sugar also means corn syrup, while in the Soviet Union we mostly consume sugar in the sugar form or candy. And I have my personal sugar story for you. So my wife, Cheryl, she's an American. A while back she asked me like, do you know what's going on with sugar? And I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, I never bought that much sugar in my life, but since I married you, like I keep on buying sugar because we're constantly low. And I was like, I don't know, I'm just drinking tea, and I realized I add so much sugar to my tea. It's like always 2 full teaspoons, and it was normal. But no, that's how I grew up back in the Soviet Union. We always used a lot of sugar while drinking tea. And of course, over the years, my wife was keep on harassing me that it's not healthy, not healthy. And I was slowly cutting down sugar. And then when I went to Ukraine to visit my mom, I saw her adding again 2 big spoons of sugar to my tea. I was like, whoa, please don't. It's too sweet. So my taste changed, but I said I consume a lot of sugar in the pure form while drinking tea. And of course, Soviets used to make a lot of jams and jellies. I don't know how much homemade jams and jellies were made in America in 1980s, but This is another big thing. We preserved a lot of usually strawberries and other berries, so a lot of sugar went into jellies. And of course, a lot of sugar was purchased to make moonshine, samagon. And I already made a video on this topic, link will be below in the comment section. So CIA had no way to figure out of this 13% of sugar consumption in the Soviet Union, how much of it went consumed directly, was used for make jellies, or was used to make moonshine. And another interesting detail about sugar, sachar, it was quite expensive. So we had sugar granulated, we call it sugar sand, сахарный песок, it was 78 kopecks per kilogram. Or you could purchase sugar in cubes, sachar rafinat, for 94 kopecks a kilogram. So if you make 150 rubles a month, that means you could purchase 192 kilograms of sugar on your monthly salary. So if you look at the current American prices, about $3.19 for 4-pound bag, that means your salary in America would be right now, sugar for sugar, just $338. So Soviet worker, full-time worker, union member, was making $338 based on current sugar prices United States of America. Okay, now let's talk about dairy and eggs. 11% Soviet Union, 12% United States. I wonder if butter went into dairy category and then went into fats. Probably into fats, but anyway, let's talk about eggs, яйца. Okay, I have to mention that Russian word for eggs, яйца, is also used for testicles. So all the humors about balls in Russian language, it's the jokes about eggs. Surprise, surprise, Soviet eggs, ha ha ha, were also quite expensive. 1 ruble 10 kopecks per 10. Not per dozen, we sold our eggs by tens. So which means that in 1980s, with 150 rubles salary a month, Soviet worker was making 8.5 eggs per hour. Compare that to America in 1980s. Eggs were $1 per dozen and minimum wage was $3.35 an hour, which means that American minimum wage was 36 eggs per hour versus Soviet average wage of 8.5 eggs. So Soviet worker, full-time worker, labor union member was making 4 times less money in eggs versus American minimum wage worker. 36 eggs an hour in the United States versus 8.5 eggs an hour in the Soviet Union. Okay, so let's take a look at fats and oils. 17% Soviet Union, 18% United States, pretty much same numbers. But we're talking about human consumption. We still are humans. Doesn't matter if you were Soviet human or American human. Okay, so let's talk here about butter, masla. So in the Soviet Union, once again, it was quite expensive. 3 rubles 50 kopecks per kilogram. And what's weird, it usually was sold deli style, so not pre-packed. You get in line, and then when it's your turn, you ask lady to cut you 100 grams or 200 grams of butter, and she will slice butter, wait for you, wrap it. So it took forever to buy butter. And with the average 150 rubles a month salary in the Soviet Union, you could buy about 43 kilograms of butter. So modern days America, I did some math, so it's a $9 per kilogram. You guys don't sell in kilograms, of course, but it comes to $9 per kilogram, which means that if you can afford only 43 kilograms of butter in America right now, your salary, once again, is only $387. So this is what Soviets had to deal with. Our salaries were so low, if you look like butter for butter, sugar for sugar. But still, considering the fact how expensive butter was, we consumed about the same amount of butter as Americans, so that's quite impressive. And now let's talk about 4 elephants in the room: bread, potatoes, meat, and fish. So here where we notice quite a difference in consumption. So meat and fish, 8% in the Soviet Union versus 21% in the United States. So almost triple, right? Almost 3 times less meat and fish was consumed in the Soviet Union. And when it comes to bread and potatoes, actually the CIA report says grain and potatoes, but I believe most grain was consumed as bread in the Soviet Union. So bread and potatoes, almost 50% of Soviet calories came from these 2 sources. Well, maybe macaroni and spaghetti we can add to that too, versus American 26%. And if you ask me, I can say that Soviet diet was a poor man's diet where most calories came from the cheapest products, bread and potatoes. And in America, it's more balanced, I guess, because if you add bread and potatoes with meat in the Soviet Union, it's 52% of all the calories. And in America, it's 47%. So together, they around 50%, but Americans had more quality food in the regards of high protein content, meat and fish. And personally, I'm not surprised at all because I'm myself a bread and potatoes and meat guy. I like to eat bread with pretty much everything I eat. So if I have mashed potatoes and cutlet, I also have a slice of bread. If I eat soup, I also need bread. So pretty much almost every dish I eat, except any like sweet stuff dishes, I always like to have a slice of bread with it. And I need to mention something about quality of meat. So when it comes to beef, Soviet beef was poor quality because most beef came from the retired milk cows. I remember my grandparents, after the cow would get old, they will take it to the slaughterhouse and sell it for meat. So our meat was really tough, old, chewy, and usually you have to boil it. So we had no such a concept like a nice steak. Still, I personally prefer processed meat over steak. I know it sounds wild for my American viewers, but yeah, if you give me an offer here, there's a nice steak or there's a hot dog, most likely I'll go for hot dog. Not most likely, I'll go for hot dog. And when it comes to the quality of the fish in the Soviet stores, we usually had a separate store called Ryba, or Rybные продукты, so fish. Wasn't that impressive either. The only fresh, like live fish available was carp. And I know most people in America don't eat carp. It considers to be trash fish. We also had some frozen like sea fish, like moiva, capelin, mintai, pollock, and hake. So those are not really premium, but that's the only one you could get in a frozen form. And of course, we consumed a lot of canned fish. That was definitely we had plenty of those items. Shelves were always had canned fish. That was item there was never shortage of. I ate a lot of canned fish, and my favorite was always kilka в томатном соусе, so that's sprats in tomato paste. And I have a couple of cans right now that I bought recently, and I gotta keep it for the New Year celebration. I also ate a lot of fish while I was on my summer break in northern Ukraine. My grandpa did fishing, then my dad, also me and my friends. We caught a lot of fish. Караси, верховодки, плотва, вьюны. I don't know the English names. So that's that freshwater fish, and we usually fried it. I never liked boiled fish, and also we made taranka, so that's a salted dry fish. Only when I came to America in 1995, so at that time I was 24 years old, and that was the very first time I tried salmon. Salmon was not available in the stores, it was deficit. And the next year, 1996, I experienced American all-you-can-eat fish at the Big Boy restaurant. And I ate so much that I literally passed out at the table. Like I blacked out, and my friend caught me before I collapsed off the chair. And if you read my book, American Diaries 1996, you may recognize that story. And when it comes to caviar, I had a chance to try it only twice while I lived in Ukraine. It was in the form of sandwiches, so it's a toasted white bread with butter, and then you put black caviar or red caviar. Both times it was during my relatives' weddings. Otherwise, my family never had caviar in our refrigerator. And now it's time to talk about bread and potatoes, because as you see, that's what the huge difference between Soviet consumption and American consumption. We ate so much bread and potatoes, it was almost 50% of our diet, while Americans only 26%. I already made a video about bread in the Soviet Union, and if you're interested in that topic, I'll provide the link below in the comment section. So bread was good quality most of the time. I always found it delicious, and it was very cheap because bread was subsidized by the government. There was never a shortage of bread in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, but when I spent my summers out in the village, I spent a lot of time in the bread lines because bread was delivered only 3 times a week. I believe it was maybe Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The truck came about 4 p.m., but people would get in the line around 2 p.m. because if you come late, you could be out of luck and out of bread. And I wonder if CIA was aware that Soviet peasants tried to buy as much bread as possible because they used it to feed the animals, chickens and pigs, since bread was so cheap, and it was almost impossible to purchase animal feed. Of course, if you work at a collective farm, you could steal some, but otherwise, people substitute bread as animal feed. So I'm not sure how much of that 44% bread and potato slice actually went to the animals. And now let's talk about kartoshka, potatoes, which was a major staple food for most Soviet citizens. We consume a lot of potatoes, and one of the reasons is because we ate a lot of soups and borsches, and soup should have potatoes. This is an argument I have with my wife every time she makes tomato soup. I'm like, that's not real soup. Real soup should have potatoes. Potatoes were relatively cheap, and I will explain in a second why I say relatively. The price at the stores were 10 kopecks per kilogram, so average worker could purchase 1,500 kilograms of potatoes every month. If you look at the minimum wage in the United States, after taxes it's $960, and I just looked at the Walmart, you can buy a 5-pound bag of potatoes for $3. So that means it's about 75 cents per kilogram. So if you work minimal wage, take home $960, that means that you can buy 1,280 kilograms of potatoes as a minimal wage worker. It's $7.25 an hour versus average Soviet worker, labor union member, full-time worker could buy 1,500 kilograms, so slightly more. So if we use potato standard instead of gold standard, Soviet average salary of 150 rubles per month would be equal $1,125 after taxes in United States, based on buying power at 75 cents per kilogram of potatoes, or $3 for 5 pounds. And I'm planning to make a separate video where using potato standard, sugar standard, egg standard, bread standard, meat standard, trying to find this average number, how much Soviet 150 rubles average salary would be now in America using modern day American grocery prices. So if we find the number, I don't know, maybe $1,000 or $900, this is pretty much, okay, this is what you have left after rent, which was really cheap in the Soviet Union. And now see if you try to survive as a Soviet worker buying groceries in American supermarket. But the problem with the cheap potatoes in the government stores was that they usually were poor quality potatoes. So most people try to grow their own. Otherwise, you have to buy them at the bazaars, like collective farm markets. And prices there were double usually what you could get at the normal store. So instead of 10 kopecks a kilogram, you have to pay 20. This picture was taken sometime in the 1970s in northern Ukraine, not far from my village. And this is ladies, collective farm workers, sorting potatoes out in the field. So they use this primitive potato storage. They basically would dig a shallow trench, lay it with a straw, pile potatoes on the top, cover it again with the straw, then cover it all with the dirt, make a couple vent holes, and that's how they would store potatoes in the winter. Then in the spring, they come with a tractor and trucks, and the ladies would get on their knees and start sorting potatoes, throwing bad ones away, and putting good ones into the baskets, which will be then taken to a city to be sold. And you may imagine that such storage is not the ideal storage for potatoes. If the weather is bad, if it was raining too much, a lot of potatoes can get rotten. And it was the familiar smell every time you walk into the ovoshi frukty store. So it's a fruits and vegetable store. There was always this specific smell in that store of the rotten potatoes and veggies. And once again, I'm not sure what numbers CIA used for their calculations. Was it based on the Soviet statistics of potatoes grown, or actually potatoes that got delivered into the stores? Like, did they count the losses? Because I believe losses were quite substantial. And this is why a lot of city folk in the Soviet Union tried to grow their own potatoes. So they had those small tiny lots outside the city, so-called dachas. And once again, I have a couple videos on that topic. Links will be below in the comment section. So they grew their own potatoes, which means they'll get premium quality potatoes because their losses will be next to zero. and they will save money. For example, my family never purchased potatoes. We always went to the villages to help our grandparents, so my parents' parents, to plant potatoes, then to harvest potatoes, and as a thank you we'll get, I think it was like 4 sacks of potatoes, and each sack is about 50 kilograms, and that number usually will get us through the winter. And my father built a special potato storage box on the balcony, which was insulated because balcony was unheated, so in the winter it could get really cold, and that's where we stored our potatoes. And it was really handy for my mom just go on the balcony, get as many potatoes as she wanted, and she used it for cooking. Personally, when I saw the CIA report, I was a little bit surprised quite a bit, because I grew up in the Soviet Union. I've seen Soviet grocery stores. I saw how my parents struggled to get meat or fish, butter, just basic goods. So when you see a report that says, hey, Soviet people ate just as good as Americans and even healthier, makes me really wonder how correct this information. And I can compare. I saw Soviet stores, and in 1995 I saw American supermarket. But even if this information is 100% correct, which I really doubt, it would be more credit to the Soviet people than to the socialist system, because despite all the problems and how expensive the most groceries were, Soviet people still managed to eat well, and maybe even better than Americans. You should recognize this picture. This is Comrade Boris Yeltsin, one of the top Soviet communist apparatchiks during his visit in Texas. I believe it's 1989 or 1990. He decided to make a surprise visit to just your average American supermarket. He was literally blown away by the variety of the goods at that store, and the fact that he had access to the special closed stores available only for the, as I said, top Communist Party leaders and people with connections. So even he was shocked how much groceries is available in the average American supermarket. And once again, if you want to learn more about Yeltsin's visit to Texas, I have a couple videos on this topic. Link will be again in the comment section. And over the years, I had a lot of comments from my viewers like this one. This is a story about Soviet bananas. I worked with a woman who was able to get out of the USSR and went to Vienna, so it's Austria. She said she cried when she first went to a grocery store because she had never seen so many bananas. Here's another one. My son used to get his hair cut by an older Russian lady. I would talk to her when we brought him in, and she told us about growing up in Moscow, going to college, and moving to the US right after the fall of the Soviet Union. She said the first time she went to an American grocery store, she put her face in her hands and cried. She couldn't believe how much food there was, and how easy it was to get comparing to her time in Moscow. And now Moscow was best supplied city in the Soviet Union. This was also not in a major American city, but in a smaller city in Wisconsin, and yet food was much easier to get than the capital of the Soviet Union. Here's another comment. I remember around 1989 when I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So we had a Soviet refugee family that moved in upstairs from us, and I just remember that my friend's mother cried when she entered an American grocery store. I think it was Myers. I remember her crying because she saw so many oranges stacked like pyramid, but there were oranges behind every single one, and bananas. I cannot get that memory out of my head. My mother tried to console her, saying it's okay, those are not fake. Little did my mother and myself know that my friend's mother was crying because they were real. And speaking of fake oranges and bananas, this is the photo from the Soviet movie. Unfortunately, I forget what is the title. But they using banana props, plastic green bananas, because they couldn't get bananas to film the movie. And of course that situation with food happened not only in the Soviet Union. There's a comment, my mother and her side of the family grew up under Mao, always said there was no food in China, so when they came to Canada in 1980s, everything was a shock. My grandma cried because there was food everywhere and people had shoes and clothes. And while researching for this video, I stumbled upon this information. So this is a weekly basket for 4 people of consumer goods at the Soviet level of consumption of March 1979, expressed in work time units. So how many minutes you need to work. And if you look carefully, Washington, Moscow, pretty much everything is more expensive, at least double, triple, quadruple in Soviet Union comparing with America. The prices were close enough for carrots. 4 minutes in Washington versus 5 minutes in Soviet Union. Cod, fish, 50-50. But even bread, 48 minutes in Washington and 72 minutes in the Soviet Union. Like, if you remember, I was talking about minimum wage in the USA versus average wage in the Soviet Union. So groceries were hard to get and extremely expensive. So it's no wonder that anyone who worked at the meat processing plant or other similar facilities were trying to steal food, sausages, kielbasas and everything else as much as they could. And it was well known. Once again, I had a video on that topic about Nisuni, the carriers. It was so widespread that it wasn't considered stealing. It was called just they were carrying stuff out. Okay, my friends, it's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this another long and boring video from Ushanka Show. And if you liked it, please don't forget to support it with your likes, your comments, and your super thanks. Thank you so much for watching Ushanka Show. До побачення. Goodbye.